Thanks for the introduction and thanks for joining me for this talk today. We already heard the title, The Role of Human Nature Interactions in Agriculture and Land Use Change is what I'm going to talk about, and I'll present some recent research results from me and my group. So let me get started with something maybe a bit more general, and this is also some of the outputs from the so-called Nexus assessment, which I was happy to be part of, which has just been actually released in its complete form, the IPBES Nexus assessment, which looks at the interlinkages between biodiversity, water, food, and health. And in the chapter that I was part of, we looked at basically what have been the trends and how have these interactions played out in the past. I just want to show some graphs here to give you an impression. And I think most of you are aware that it's not looking that great for biodiversity. The index of ecosystem conditions you see here has been going down. The index of species survival has been going down. And at the same time, also freshwater availability and climate-related disasters have been increasing. At the same time, we have seen an increase in food supply and also at the same time an increase of life expectancy due to different causes, but also because food supply has been going up. So I think most of us would agree that a lot of that increasing food supply, unfortunately, has also increased with tremendous costs for biodiversity. And that is basically also what I'm partly looking at in my own group. So the question is now, how do we actually kind of bring this together? Because of course we want to have this improvement, but at the same time, we also maybe do not want to have this loss of biodiversity. And there are different options that we can do, but basically what people also nowadays are agreeing on is that simple biodiversity conservation is not enough to bend this curve. Of course, if we continue with this business as usual scenario, biodiversity will continue to go down. So yes, we need increased conservation efforts, but maybe even more important, what we need are more sustainable production and a sustainable consumption. And this would actually then be a real game changer when we talk about biodiversity conservation. And of course, agriculture is one dimension of that in terms of production and consumption. So let's talk now a little bit more about what we have been doing also in my group, and I'm going to present some results. And I'll start with one study where we actually now thought about, so, okay, let's say we want to reduce the loss of biodiversity from agriculture. How can we do that? What would be policy options? And here, this study was part of Eclipse project. Eclipse is a science policy interface that basically invites experts to develop short assessments for policymakers, and the requests, they actually come from the policymakers themselves. So it's not scientists that think, okay, what would be an interesting question? But the question comes from the policymakers because they actually have a demand for that. So this was the output of that, and you can download it for free. And I'm going to present just some results of that. Focusing here on that agricultural part, because we took that here as one example of small and medium enterprises in the food industry to evaluate the potential of different policy options. We did, first of all, of course, extensive literature reviews and compared it to determine actually what policy options exist. And then what we found was that, and I'm sure you would also agree with that, that what we typically find is that there are these kind of two broad bodies of literature. One is more about the perception and adoption of policies. So, how does a policy need to look like so that farmers adopt it? While the other part of the research is more about how does it actually affect biodiversity in the field? The first part is more done by political scientists, social scientists, maybe. The second part is mostly being done then by maybe ecologists that actually evaluate biodiversity. But this link is hardly made, and there's often this mismatch. And so we wanted to do a quantitative study where we are trying to make this link. And so we co-developed the model together with different stakeholders during a workshop to capture this whole impact pathway on the EU level. So we compared different policy options, and we first of all defined what policy options are we looking at. One was we said, okay, what would happen if we focus more on regulation of harmful pesticides in agriculture? The second option was, what about payments for ecosystem service? What if we compensate farmers for their costs if they conserve biodiversity on their fields, and we evaluate how well that also contributes to ecosystem services on a larger scale? The co-design of a label for sustainable agriculture was a third policy option. They're focusing more on the markets, but making sure that it's also, considering the needs of farmers. A fourth one was, how about subsidies that come from the government, from the EU, for organic farming, and we increased that. And the third one was kind of a mix of the regulation plus the subsidization, based on a specific target to be reached. So we wanted to compare those different policy options, and we kind of developed this conceptual model that you can see here. And you can see these 5 policy options. And of course, they are all different in terms of their policy attributes. So how flexible are they, how legally binding, and so on. We described that when we designed them. And then we looked at, what do people think, how high would the adoption be? And in the next step, what do people think, how high would then the implementation be on the farm? And then in the last one would be, how much would that then improve biodiversity? So we defined all of these different nodes in our model, and we also defined the different interactions. And we came up with a relatively complex Bayesian network model to then model this. And just in a nutshell, you can see the results here. So what we found was that the highest probability to actually improve biodiversity significantly can be achieved with regulation. So looking here at this graph, with regulation, or with a mix of the different policies. But that is mainly because we have this incredibly high adoption rate for regulation, because of course a regulation is something which is valid for everyone, and so people actually need to adopt it. And that therefore we have just a very broad impact, even if the actual impact on the field itself are maybe not as much as if we have, one of the other policy options. So we have this high adoption and compliancy rates making up for overall less ambitious biodiversity measures. However, if we would find a way how to bring, adoption up in for the other policy options, then this could actually also improve biodiversity outcomes, because as you all know, regulations are often difficult to implement. There's a lot of resistance among the farmers, and it also often takes a while. So, for example, payments for ecosystem services, and we also did another study on this here, now going away from Europe, but looking into Tanzania. And here we wanted to take a look at under which conditions basically these conservation compensation schemes are adopted. And here in that study, we specifically focused also what's the impact of land size, of unequal land size, because maybe some farmers who have smaller land size would be less likely to, or less willing to do conservation measures on their field, even if they are compensated for it. So what we did was a lab and the field experiment with Tanzanian farmers from 2 different ecological corridors. You can see here up in the north and the south, between protected areas. And then we asked them to conserve whether they would be in this game and this hypothetical land, if they would be willing to conserve a certain area under different compensation schemes. So we designed different compensation schemes, and we want to find out, so how should the payment scheme look like to convince as many farmers as possible to conserve, and how does land size and personal values of the farmer also influence that decision? So we built these groups where we had 4 farmers always playing together, and they were given then hypothetical land, and the share of the land between those farmers was either equal or unequal. So in some groups, some farmers had more land available. So as I said, the land that we gave to them was hypothetical. It was a game, but the payments they would receive at the end, depending on their decision whether to farm or to conserve, those were real payments. And then we played 3 consecutive rounds with different compensation schemes where those were the treatment groups. And then we also had a control group where they wouldn't receive any compensation at all, and they could just decide freely maybe to conserve or not to conserve, and even if they are not being compensated for it. So in the first round, neither the treatment nor the control group received any payment. In the second round, in the treatment group, the farmers would receive a conditional payment if they decided to conserve. And in the second round, they would receive, on top of that conditional payment, an additional payment, like a bonus, if farmers within that group would decide that they are conserving as a group, and therefore conserving a larger area. And we want to look at aspects such as cooperation and these things in the group. And then subsequently, we did a survey on different socioeconomical variables such as gender, age, education, and so on, but also on the value sets of farmers that maybe motivated their conservation behaviors, such as biospheric or egoistic values. So they had these statements they could either agree or disagree with, and based on that, we developed scores for different value sets. So what we found was, interestingly, that values seem to often matter more than money and compensation. So interestingly, land equality did not affect the decisions of the farmers to conserve. And overall, both payment schemes, no matter if you had a bonus or if you had only the compensation scheme, both of them worked and overall increased the decision to conserve. However, in terms of values, interestingly, we found that the biospheric values, they supported conservation behavior, while egoistic values lowered it. So farmers who had higher values there, they were also more likely generally to conserve. However, the payment scheme did not really affect the conservation behavior when the biospheric value was high. So that means if you have farmers with very high biospheric values, it does actually not matter as much anymore how much you pay them or not. So what that tells us is that actually increasing these biospheric values among farmers and pro-environmental values could considerably actually reduce costs and would make sense in the long run. So values overall seem to matter, and they of course matter what we value today, but they also maybe have an impact on the future. And in this case study that I'm going to talk about, we want to take a look at that in rural Namibia. But first of all, let me show you some results also from literature review that we did. So values matter, and if for the decisions that people are taking, and therefore also the values that ecosystems are having, they are increasingly being evaluated, not only looking at the economic values and not only at the biophysical values, but also taking more participatory approaches to evaluating ecosystems. And we can see that here, for example, this increase of studies on valuation, and that there is quite a huge share of around 80% also taking a participatory approach to valuation of ecosystems. But when we look at what are they actually being used for, is that the non-participatory studies, they mostly focus exclusively on regulating ecosystem services, while the non-participatory focus mostly on regulating ecosystem services, while the participatory ones, they are usually combining different ecosystem service groups, so regulating ecosystem service provisioning as well as cultural. And of course, the reason is because it's easier to ask people than to actually collect hardcore data on the field about these different services. but still, I think it's interesting to acknowledge that if you want to take a systems perspective, then these participatory evaluation studies seem to be a better fit for that. So yes, values matter for our behavior, of course, but behavior is probably also linked. So the behavior we're showing today is also probably linked to the perceptions of the future and what I think in terms of the agency I have about the future. So how much power do I actually have about what's happening around me, and how much can I influence that? And that's what we would define as agency here. So if you think about it, if you have the presence, then of course there are multiple potential futures possible, but some of them are maybe not very probable. Yeah? So, but others are. So we narrow it down to the probable futures. But even then, there might be some, which I think are more desirable, which can be probable or they cannot be probable, but it's what I wish for. Yeah, so I maybe want to have certain things in the future. I maybe want to see more protected areas, or want to see less. I want to see more agriculture, things like this. So there is a difference between what's maybe probable and desirable. And we wanted to measure what people perceive as valuable today, but also in the future, and what the difference is between the probable and the desirable. And in that study, we defined that kind of gap as the level of agency. So we used, in order to assess these values, we used the so-called nature futures framework, which you can see here. So what it basically does is it says, well, nature can be valued for very different reasons. It can be valued as the concept of, nature for society. I value nature because I'm depending on it, and I'm maybe, because I have agricultural fields and so on. But it can also be valued for its own sake. So nature also has an intrinsic value, and that would be the second dimension. And the other dimension would be nature as culture. So this is a concept which is maybe more relevant in communities where we have traditionally a very close link of culture and nature. So larger link to spirituality of nature. And so we used this framework basically, and we conducted then surveys, interviews, and also participatory mapping exercises, asking questions about probable and desirable futures and the values of people. And we did that in Namibia, as I said, and we did it in different villages, of which some were closer to the road and some were further away from the road, because in that specific study, we were also wanted to know how does actually the road affect this level of agency. And as you can see up here in this map, it was in Namibia on the border to Zambia and Zimbabwe. And it's this kind of, because there is a large road that has been developed and which was quite important for the region there, but it's also quite important in terms of biodiversity and tourism. So here you can see some of the maps that were drawn by the communities. So what we did was we went there in the actual villages, and then we let the people draw what they value, what they think is, probably going to happen, what they would see as a desirable future. And we could see that there were actually quite some differences between those maps. And we also asked the people then to, to give values to these three different dimensions. And as I said, we measured then the level of agency as the difference between what they think is probably going to happen in the future and what they think would be desirable. And that difference was then, if the difference was large, they had lower agency, and the difference was low, then they had higher agency. So what we found was that generally close to roads, higher education actually equaled also a higher level of agency, at least for the dimension nature for culture. Yeah, so people had higher education, they seem to have a higher agency there. And away from roads, it was the opposite. So here education seemed to have the opposite effect, and people actually perceived the agency to be lower. Also, what we found significantly, at least so far away from roads, that age seemed to be negatively associated. So young men seem to have a higher agency um, over future for nature, for culture, and also gender. Yeah? So it was in particular young men that seemed to have a higher agency. And what that shows us is that actually location also matters when you're looking at these things, and also education matters because that influences how people perceive their capacity also to shape future human-nature relationships across different value dimensions. And it's important to consider this when we are thinking about what do people value and why do they actually value what they value. So let me now come to some of my conclusions. So what we can say based on these studies, but also other studies, of course, is that agriculture and land use are important drivers of biodiversity loss, but also potential leverage points to bend this curve that I talked about, the biodiversity loss curve. And policies can actually support biodiversity conservation, but need to consider also the levels of adoption as well as the impact on biodiversity on the ground. And as we saw, there is actually limited scientific evidence on both in combination, and bringing that together, I think, can really help us to make reasonable choices about policies. The values that farmers have internalized, what's their role in society, what do they value for the future, that seems to be key for higher adoption rates of biodiversity-friendly policies and measures. And these values are increasingly explored in many different studies, like the studies that I have presented here. But we also need to acknowledge that these values are changing over time, and that they are influenced by education and spatial location. So if we can also say that we want to maybe invest in those values and how these values can maybe change over time. And the last point is that this perception of agency is quite important, because it's not only about what do I value today, but also what do I think is actually possible in the future. And that is quite relevant if we want to think about sustainability transformation, because what I decide today is probably also affected by what I plan for in the future. And with that, I'm at the end, and thank you very much.